There had never been anything in Lila's life that hinted she would one day reach such exhaustion. Yet she had always known deep within her that sorrow, once it begins, does not easily retreat. Ever since her husband Hussam had passed away 4 months earlier, the warmth in the house had faded, and her chest felt filled with small, heavy stones that grew with every morning. She tried to remain strong for her little boy Yasser, but he was too young to understand anything except that his mother's embrace was the only world that would never betray him. Still, their presence together was never welcome in the house they lived in. Lila's stepmother saw them as an unnecessary burden. All Lila ever received from her was criticism and shouting, as if a woman who had just lost her husband needed any more breaking. And on that night that felt longer than any other, her stepmother stood at the door, her face ablaze with anger, and said in a venomous voice, "I won't keep supporting you and your child. This house is not an orphanage. Your husband is dead, and everything is over." Lila trembled like a broken branch in a relentless wind and held her son close, trying to hide her shaking heart from him, but failing. The words fell on her like cold arrows, pushing her toward a cliff she no longer knew how to step back from. She found refuge only in silence, knowing that arguing was useless, and that her voice, no matter how loud, would change nothing. Even when she tried to tell her stepmother she was looking for a job and would leave as soon as she found a place suitable for her and her child, she received only cruel mockery. The night was heavy, but the question weighing on her was heavier. Where could she go? What home would take in a lone woman with a child? And what work could she start with no support and no one to lean on? Yet despair was not the only thing she knew. Inside her was a small strength, like an ember beneath ash, refusing to die. The next morning she left the house with her child, carrying nothing but a small bag and a few clothes, not looking back because looking back felt too much like pleading, and she refused to appear weak before a woman who longed to see her crumble. She walked without knowing her destination, but her steps were steady, as if the ground itself knew the path that would reveal itself to her. She reached a long street lined with tall trees and paused to catch her breath. Her child slept on her shoulder, his small warmth making her feel that everything in the world could be repaired as long as he remained in her arms. In front of her stood an old stone building with a sign reading Al-Nahar Library, books and manuscripts. She had known books since childhood. They were her only refuge in a house lacking kindness. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The library was unusually quiet. An elderly man sat behind a wooden desk, his eyes sharp with a depth that seemed to understand things long before they were spoken. He looked up and said gently, "You look tired. Can I help you?" She had no energy to hide the truth and told him she was looking for a job, any job, just enough to secure a place to live. After studying her face for a moment, he asked, "Can you read?" She smiled saintly. "Read? It's the one thing I truly know how to do." He nodded. "Then come tomorrow. Perhaps we can find a place for you here." She walked out of the library feeling for the first time since Hussam's death that the world had not completely closed its doors. That evening, as she stood on the sidewalk wondering where to spend the night, an old woman selling flowers approached her and said in a voice like a story, "Those who are lost halfway are the closest to arrival." Layla didn't understand, but she asked if the woman knew a place to rent, even a small room. The old woman pointed to a nearby building and said, "Ask there. Faces with sorrow like yours are never turned away." And so she found the room, narrow but warm enough to feel like the beginning of a new life. The next morning she sat in the library for the first time, writing down book titles and dusting shelves. The owner, whose name was Nader, was quiet but kind. Slowly, she began to feel she belonged somewhere. Over time, he noticed her intelligence and precision, giving her more delicate tasks, even allowing her to handle rare books no one else was permitted to touch. Life wasn't easy, but it was bearable. Her son Yasser found his own place in the library, crawling between the shelves and laughing as dust danced in the sunlight, as if the new world welcomed him in silence. But life does not give without testing, and just when Layla felt her steps growing steadier, a letter arrived from the court informing her that the financial matters of her late husband, frozen due to disputes with his family, had finally been settled. She might be the sole heir to what remained of his small properties. She didn't seek wealth, only enough to live in peace, but the paper frightened her, for her husband's family had never cared for her, and they would not easily accept that she walk away carrying what Hussam had left. That night, fear returned to her as if it had never left. She sat beside her small window watching her child sleep and felt her life changing again. But this time, she was not alone. There was a child who saw her as her entire world, an old man who opened his library to her, and a flower seller who believed that being lost could sometimes be a path. Layla lifted her gaze to the dark ceiling and whispered to her own heart, "I will not go back. This is my life now, and I will protect it." And as the night slowly welcomed the dawn, she understood that her journey was no longer one of escape, but one of building, and that the world, even in its cruelty, always left a small window for light, only for those brave enough to search for it.